Design Lab Project 5. DL5 consists of 4 parts: DL5A, DL5B, DL5C, and DL5D. Each one will teach you a little more about non-destructive editing techniques and making image adjustments and image corrections in Photoshop. 3 of these are borrowed from an early Adobe Classroom in a Book set of tutorials. I do a little more with them than Adobe did with them because I think there's more to be gained from each exercise. If you just double click on it, it may open in preview or on the PC in the photo viewer. This isn't a place to edit things. Or you can right click on it and tell it to open in a particular program. In this case, Photoshop. Or from Photoshop, you can go to the File pull down and find Open, or notice that the shortcut is Control-O. I use a lot of shortcuts. I use shortcuts for commonly used functions whenever possible. Fingers on the keyboard are usually much faster than moving the mouse to a pull-down menu to find a function. So if you can remember these, it'll save time. Remember that the mouse was invented at Xerox PARC, Palo Alto Research Center, in the 1970s as part of the point-and-touch graphical user interface. The object was to make computers accessible to preschoolers. It's an okay drawing tool, but for many tasks, the keyboard is faster. Most common commands have shortcuts in all programs. When I can't remember a shortcut or none exists, I go to the pull down and hope I can remember which pull down it is. So Command-O, and if you're not pointed at the correct folder, then you should locate the correct folder here. You can browse, you got quick access. You can say, well, this was on my desktop somewhere. I can browse my desktop. I know I've got this in a folder. I've got this in a folder for Photoshop demos. You can see I have it in a folder here, DL5 resources. This one was put together in spring of 2019, so it says S19, the last time that I modified these projects. And I can select this and open it this way. I mentioned in the introduction to this module that file size and understanding file size is important. There are a number of ways you can look at file size. I'm going to go back to the file folder for the resources, and this is showing large icons. Could put it in a list view and it just lists them, or details. On the Mac, there are similar viewing options for looking at folders. And on the Mac, I can't recall if you can actually see file sizes, but on the PC, I know you can. So size for DL5A, sort by name, this is 174 kilobytes. This is a fairly small file. You can also, in the icon mode, right click and find at the bottom of a list properties, and it will show you that it's 173 kilobyte file or 176 kilobyte on disk, fairly small file. On the Mac, if you right click, you can find Get Info, which does the same thing as properties, or in the file pull down on the Mac, you can find Get Info and it will tell you the file size. So once again, I'll open this in Photoshop, and in Photoshop, I've got some pull downs here. File, which will show you the shortcuts such as Control-N new document, Control-O open. We'll skip browse in Bridge because I don't demonstrate Bridge in this class. You can explore it yourself. Bridge is a browser peculiar to the Adobe Creative Cloud or the Adobe Creative Software, which has more functions available in it than in the normal browsers on either a PC or a Mac. Open as, you can change what type of file it opens as. I don't think that will be necessary here. You can open recent, close, Control W, Control or Command W. Command W, think of it as close window. If this is a window, you're closing the window, Control or Command W. Close all would close all open files. Close and go to bridge, save as, save Control S, save as, Shift Control S. If you want to save it as a different name, and you will be doing that, or you want to save it as a different type of file, and you'll also be doing some of that, you do that here with Shift Control S or Command Shift S on the Mac. Some of these others we don't need to talk about right now. Let's move over to the image pull down, and image pull down shows modes, and you can see that this is a grayscale image. That will be important later when we might want to add color to it, because you can't add color to a grayscale image. We'll have to change the mode. I'm going to Command 0, which is show the full page or the full file or the full artboard in Illustrator at maximum size in the display area of your workspace. So Command 0 and then back to the image pull down mode, bitmap. In bits, bytes, and binary, I talked about bitmap being primarily used to refer to images that have pixels that are only black or white. In conventional printing before computers with film and plates, we would call this line art, meaning there's a line at which everything above that gray value becomes white and everything below it becomes black. So that's a bitmap. Going to Command Z, undo. This might be a good time to also mention the history palette, which every time I do something, it's going to show it in the history palette. And Command Z will go back in the history palette. Command Shift Z will go forward in the history palette. So you can Command Z, undo, Command Shift Z, redo the last thing that you did. And if you had several steps in your history palette, you could Command Z all the way back about 20 steps. I think the history palette is limited to a specific number of steps. And I think that might be changed in the preferences for Photoshop. So Command Z, so I'm back to grayscale. We will talk about these other colors when we get to the part where we're going to actually add colors to this image. Image size, Alt Control I or Command Option I on the Mac. The image size, the file size is 234.4K. It actually saves slightly smaller because JPEG has compression. The actual dimensions are 400 pixels by 600 pixels. Fit to original size, you could fit it to other sizes, but I want to be specific about what we're doing here. The original width of approximately 1 inch by 1.5 inches is about the size of a postage stamp, but it is really high resolution for that size. You can resample it, but if you resample it, pixels change, and they may change in undesirable ways. For example, if I resample this to 4 inches high by 2 2/3 inches wide at the same resolution, you would think you were getting more detail, but actually you're just getting a fuzzier picture with the same limited detail. Command Z, Command Option I, go back to image size. If I resample it downward, like say make this 150 pixels at the same size, you can see I've just cut that from 400 pixels by 600 pixels to 150 pixels by 225 pixels. This is pixels per inch, so obviously if it's 150 pixels wide, that's 1 inch wide approximately. I'll say OK. And you can see that there's a tremendous loss of detail. If you've seen crime scene shows on TV where they enlarge an image to the point where they can identify a person or read a license plate number when the image looks like this, it doesn't really happen that way. If I try to sharpen the image, there'll be a filter, sharpen, it doesn't look much better. There's no more detail there. If I, let's say, try sharpen more, there's still not much detail there. Command Z, Command Z. I could try Smart Sharpen, which is handy for some things sometimes, but it's not going to bring a lot of detail back from something that has no detail. You could do a 200% increase in sharpness, make the radius larger, make it smaller, reduce noise, correct lens blur. It's not going to make a difference. There's no detail there to really enhance. And in my history panel, I'll go back to my original file. What I want you to do for this project is change the image size without resampling. I want to keep it at 400 pixels by 600 pixels, but I would like it to be 4 inches tall by 2 2/3 inches wide. So same size file, same number of pixels, but now we're looking at something that would print at 4 inches high. The Adobe Classroom in a book tutorial used this as a demonstration for fixing flaws in a photograph, just a simple retouching of the big white spots and scratches you see everywhere. I think we can learn a lot more from it than just doing destructive retouching, which would be, for example, taking the spot healing brush and just cleaning out all these spots here. This is destructive editing. These are permanent changes to the pixels of the file. If I save this now, I've lost all of the original aspects of the image. Now here I just accidentally did this too wide and smeared up his head. I can reduce the size of this. A couple of ways to do that. One is in the control panel, you can adjust the hardness and the size of any tool. This I want to keep fairly soft. I want it to blend into the background well. And if I want to be careful, I'll use it small, really small, because this is a low resolution image. And I can spot these things here. Again, this is just kind of creating a smear there. So if I save it now, that stuff's gone forever. But if I go back to image size, where I am at 2 2/3 by 4 at 150 pixels per inch, then I've just eliminated all those really bad corrections that I made. One way to correct dust and scratches is with something called a filter that is dust and scratches, noise, dust and scratches. And I can set this for different radius, which means if it sees something that it thinks is a dust or scratch, it will look up to a radius of 8 pixels to try to correct that. Well, you can see I've lost all the detail in his mouth and eyes and his tie, buttons, everything has gotten blurry. So you would have to use a fairly small radius. I'll turn the preview on and off, and you can see that takes out a lot of those spots, but not the bigger ones. I can change the threshold so that a spot would have to be, in terms of gray levels, remember this is like 255 levels of gray. If something is within, say, 12 levels of gray, it will treat it as a spot. If it's a difference of 68 levels of gray, it's not going to fix it. But if it's below, say, 15, then it will treat it as a spot. So that would be those spots. I'm going to go fairly low on that because I can retouch the bigger things. About 8. Okay, but again, this is a destructive edit. This is a permanent change to the file. If I do a bunch of things to this and then want to go back and change how I did that, I can't. There's no going back on that. So again, back to image size. How do we do this non-destructively? I'm going to open my layers palette. I'm actually going to tear that off because this is something I'll need to look at a lot. Grab the bottom of this and shorten this because I don't have that many layers right at the moment. I can close those. What I would like to do is select an area where I can use a fairly aggressive dust and scratches and only use it in that area. So I'm going to select the background, or in the photo studio where this was taken, that would be referred to the backdrop. So I'll call this area the backdrop as opposed to the background, which in Photoshop means the locked base layer. You can actually unlock that and change it into a regular layer that you can do other things to, but for now, we'll leave it as a locked background layer. What can I select that with? I could use the quick select, but it's not as precise as some things. If I hold the option key, I can get the negative select and back off that selection, and that's not too bad. There's another way to select when you want to do precise work. I'm going to Command D, deselect. I'd like to point out that in Adobe Illustrator, Photoshop, and InDesign, Command D means a different thing in every program. Command D I showed you is duplicate the last step in Illustrator. In Photoshop, Command D means deselect all selections. And in InDesign, I'll talk about what it means in InDesign when we get to InDesign. The magnetic lasso can identify the edge of something based on the contrast of different areas of the image. So if I click and then drag, and I click and I let go of the mouse button and just let the tool find the edge. Here where I want a corner, I'll click, go up around this little bit of hair behind him. You might need to click there to get it to follow it. Click where it meets the ear, let it just follow the ear without holding the mouse button down. Click here, maybe there. And it does real well when there's good contrast. If you get to an area like this where the background in his hair looks about the same, you might actually have to click some points in there. His face has good contrast against the backdrop, so it'll follow that pretty well. But here in the shadows, it's kind of hard to see where his coat is. And when I get down to here, I'm just going to go back across here, and I could go all the way to there and connect it, or I could click any place here and just end that selection. Now I missed some things, so I could take my quick selection tool, hold the shift key to add. Actually, this is already set up for plus. If I was in this one, I would hold the shift key to add to an existing selection. Hold the option key or the alt key on the PC to subtract from a selection. Or with the quick select tool, you can select the plus tool to add to a selection. And this being a brush, I can actually make that larger by either going to the brush size in the control panel. I can right click and select a brush size. Oh, no, I can't. Okay. Or I can use the open and close brackets on my keyboard. And you can see this is using the close bracket, and this is using the open bracket. And that will increase the size of the brush, and it will select more stuff more quickly. Okay, so that's Fred. Now up here, I'm going to come a little closer. I use the Command plus sign on the keyboard to go straight in and see if it can't do that. Okay. If it can't do something precisely, I can take the lasso tool, hold the shift key to add to the selection. I'm going to start inside here because it doesn't matter, and then draw precisely where I want that to be. If I let go, it will close that selection. Hold the Alt or Option key, and I'll start out here and take that off because that's really more dust and scratches repair than actually part of his hair. I think over here, I can't, it seems very hard to tell, but it seems that his hair actually goes this way, and there's a little bit of hair showing there. I come into here and just let go, and it closes across there and just adds that to the existing selection. So that's Fred. I call him Fred. I don't know why. He just seemed like a Fred to me. What do I do now? Well, I want to add a new layer. And that's this little plus button on the layer mask. They changed that symbol. It used to be like a page with the corner turned, like you're adding a new page, but it's now a little square with a plus sign. Add a new layer. And on that layer, I want a mask. Now, I should explain something about the way these tools are mimicking, just like that Adobe ad that I use on the home page shows that there were actual tools that represent all of these things represent. And for example, the airbrush. If I take the brush, I can use this like an airbrush, make a new file here and demonstrate some things about the airbrush. So this is black. And of the painting tools, the one I use most is the airbrush because I used to paint with an airbrush and gouache when I retouched photographs before we had computers. This is normal. This is a size of 80, 0 hardness, so it has a soft edge. and the color is black, and that's what it looks like. And if I was painting an area with an airbrush, I would probably start off of the artboard, click, and go across in a smooth stroke. Okay, I'm going to switch to white and change the opacity to maybe 16, because more than likely, if I was trying to blend in some color, I would start with a lower opacity and then figure out how I could get that to look smooth. I could reduce the flow if I wanted this to go on. If I wanted the paint, the digital paint, to flow on slower so that I'm not making blobby messes here. Again, I start off and go across and then paint it in until it looks even. I can right click with a brush and change the size here, or as I mentioned before, you can use the open or close. You can open or close the brush size with the open and close brackets on the keyboard, although that's kind of misleading because you use the close bracket to open up the size and the open bracket to close up the size. What about hard edge brushes? I might use a hard edge if I was working on some small detail area and needed to make sure that my brush didn't spill over into something else. I can paint in straight lines with any of the Adobe tools if I hold the Shift key. So I could click at some point, hold the Shift key. Now I clicked and I let go. But if I hold the Shift key and go to another point, I can paint straight lines. I can do that with the eraser tool. That's a big eraser tool. And let's do that at 100%. Give the eraser a harder edge. That'd be something else you might want a hard edge for if you're using the eraser tool and just wanted to clean up some little area and not have the erasing spread all over. You might want a hard edge. I wanted to sharpen the edges of these lines. If you were using an airbrush and gouache paint on an actual photograph before we had computers, you would mask off an area that you didn't want paint on with something called Frisket, which was a thin adhesive sheet. It looked something like a big piece of Scotch magic mending tape. So it was sort of frosted, very thin, lighter tack than even Scotch tape. But you would press that over the surface, take a knife, and without cutting into the surface of the photo, just cut the frisket, which takes a fairly skilled hand. Cut the frisket around the thing you want to mask, just the same way that I use the lasso tool or the magnetic lasso tool or the quick select tool to select Fred. And then you would peel off the part that is in the area where you want to paint, and that would give you a hard edge. If I do hard edge masking, sometimes you want hard edge masking. Here's a paintbrush, here's black paint. To invert a selection, it's Command-Shift-I. So that inverts the selection. Command-I will invert color. whether it's color or black and white. Command Shift I, invert selection, Command I, invert color. I'll go back in my menu to last selection. So Command Shift I, I'm going to invert the selection. Let's take a closer look here. And if I paint in black on the background using the brush, it's a hard edge. And what that'll do is look like Fred is cut out and stuck on something. Command D, deselect. You can see the jaggies there. Command Z, undo my deselection. So what you would do if you wanted a softer edge, in the old days we would use a thicker frisket so that the frisket is sort of raised from the surface of the photograph, and then when you paint it, some of it kind of spills past that edge, or you can't actually spray right up to the edge because the paint doesn't go in there, so you get a softer edge, and we call that a feather. Feathering is what the brush naturally does if you have a soft edge. So let me again make this larger, right click, and I'll go to a 0 hardness or a 100% soft edge, and then I paint. That's feathered. In the old days, you would take a paintbrush, before we had airbrushes, you would take a paintbrush and just kind of keep painting outward for something until you ran out of paint on the brush, and that sort of feathered it in to the other area. So feather. I'm going to go back to my inverted selection here. You can feather a mask under Select, Modify, Feather, and 10 pixels is like a very soft feather. I'm going to go to, say, maybe 2 pixels, which should be plenty for Fred at this low resolution. Actually, at this low resolution, I'm probably better off with just a 1 pixel feather if I want to paint something in the background and have it look natural. So again, using my paintbrush, a soft edge, a 35 pixel paintbrush, and I'll go to full density on this so you get the full effect of what the feathered edge does. So there I painted, Command D, and you can see now I don't have jaggies. I have a soft edge where it has spilled past the mask. If I select, modify, feather, and I want you to notice that there's a shortcut here, Shift Function Key 6. Once I get done with this, I'm probably not going to go back to the pull down again, because I just about always use Shift and Function keys 5 and 6 are the most frequently used, at least in the work that I do in Photoshop. Function keys serve as shortcuts to the shortcuts. I'll increase this to a 5 pixel radius, and then you'll see that when I paint with this, more of the black spills in there. So for instance, if I invert the selection, Command Shift I, and I wanted to darken his shoulder here, I could paint outside the mask, and notice that the paint just spills in there. That's a bit extreme. If I kept this farther out, or if I reduce the opacity and just needed to slightly darken his shoulder, I can paint outside the mask and just let some of the paint, or the pixel paint, spill into there. Okay, that's not something I need to do on Fred, so I'm going back to my inverted selection. Now, all of those things I just showed you were destructive editing. I was changing the actual pixels in the file, or on the open file. I can go back in the history palette and undo those things, or I can Command Z all the way back. But if I save this right, let's see, let me go to here. If I'm here and I save this right now, that would permanently alter that file. And if I opened it again, it wouldn't have a history palette. The history palette is only while the file is open. Once you close the file, the history palette disappears, and what you save is whatever the last thing is that you did on that history palette. To do this non-destructively, I'm going to go back to first feather where I'm at. Actually, I'll undo it back to inverse. Okay, so shift function key 6, feather 1 pixel. So it will have a soft edge and look like it's part of the same photo, but not bleed into the point where it blurs the edge of fret. What I want to do now is use a dust and scratches filter to eliminate most of those spots. And I can do it up here, noise, dust and scratches. But again, this is a destructive edit. To do it non-destructively, and for this I'm going to open the layers palette so you can see what happens. In the filter pull down, the first item is, well, the first item is last filter, but there wasn't a filter used yet, so that won't do anything. But the first item after that is convert for smart filters. And that will convert the base layer, which says background, into a separate layer. And it now shows this little symbol here, which means that this is a smart object. And if I click on the smart object thumbnail, it opens separately in a separate file, that original file, completely unaltered. If I change anything here, which I don't want to because this is the original, and then close that window, it will update whatever change I made there here. But again, for the purposes of this exercise, I don't want any alteration to the original image. I only want the alterations to be non-destructive edits.